forward to that. Now, we're going to start off with, I guess we could describe this as propaganda. Let's bring on this BBC article that came out yesterday. Fake UK stamps blamed on Chinese-made counterfeits. Well, this was the BBC trying to tell us that some criminal activity which is happening in the UK is in fact being done by the Chinese government effectively. It is China's fault. The author here quoting Ian Duncan Smith as saying, China is behind it. This was a definitive statement. So we've all got to worry about China running economic warfare on the UK. This wasn't the only article on this topic. The Telegraph had one. China behind flood of fake stamps plaguing Britain. And so they said security experts have warned that the mass fraud is economic warfare done with the tacit approval of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, of course, by suggesting that it's tacit approval, what they're basically saying is we have no evidence for this whatsoever. So we're just going to call it tacit approval. This was, I think, actually following an article by Edward Lucas in the Mail. And the headline on this was how China could paralyse Britain and kill thousands by hacking into your electric car, locking you inside and creating deadly traffic jams. As cheap Chinese EVs flood Britain, Edward Lucas raises a terrifying possibility. And so let's see what Edward Lucas had to say. He begins with a little story narrative. It's a bitingly cold day in mid-December 2027. China is blockading Taiwan and Britain is poised to join the United States in rallying to the beleaguered island's democracy's defence, a move that would presage World War III. And then comes a brutally blunt message. Every one of the hundreds of thousands of Chinese-made electric cars on UK roads stops dead. Then the pile-ups begin as other vehicles plow into the suddenly stationary cars. Crippling traffic jams prevent emergency services reaching the scenes of accidents, and thousands of injured victims die in agony. The bullies of Beijing have just won a decisive early battle in the struggle for global domination. So this was the type of narrative that Edward Lucas pushing out in the Daily Mail without any critical thought, it seems. But the question is, what is going on here and what are these people up to? Now, to try to understand this, we're going to go back a few years to the Integrity Initiative, and let's just have a quick look at who was involved in that. So we had journalists like Carol Cadwallader here. Edward Lucas, of course, was absolutely part and parcel of Integrity Initiative. We had people like Bill Browder. We had, here's Chris Donnelly, who, of course, was in charge of the Integrity Initiative. Mark Steele also involved. He went on to handle Russiagate and so on. And this group of people, which is much broader than the five on screen at the moment, were running a propaganda campaign called the Integrity Initiative, which was designed to demonize Russia in this case. It looks like they've moved on to China in many ways, but Russia was the situation at that time. And who else was behind, or at least in the background of this organization? Well, it was this man, Richard Dearlove, former head of MI6, otherwise known, at least by me, as Old Yellowcake, because, of course, this is the man whose propaganda brought us to war in Iraq, because it was his bogus intelligence about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq that gave Tony Blair the excuse to go to war in Iraq. But of course, what else was he behind? He was behind various things, not just Russiagate, because he was effectively pulling the strings of Christopher Steele when he produced his report on Russiagate for the US. But he was also behind, indirectly, the whole Sergei Skripal affair, which again designed to generate propaganda against Russia. Now, who was funding this operation? Well, it was the Foreign Office through Andy Price as the head of Counter Disinformation. But of course, he wasn't just the head of Counter Disinformation, he was also the head of media development. And of course, this organization claimed to only ever be working abroad. But on the other hand, it was funding the Institute for Statecraft and their Integrity Initiative project here in the UK. So clearly they weren't just working abroad, and they're still not just working abroad. But where they were working abroad one place they were working abroad was Ukraine. And so Andy Price and this organization involved in 2018, in this case, with Ukrainian-British consultations on countering cyber threats. This was held in London. and so on. So back at that time, we were very keen to find out a little bit more about this organisation, and we put in a Freedom of Information request to the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, as it was then. And it said, I would like to get some background on the role currently held by Andy Price, brackets head of Counter Disinformation. Could you tell me, please, the scope of the role, the size of the team Andy Price has working with him, and when the role was created? And the response from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, after about 18 months of trying, including the intervention of the Information Commissioner, was, we're not telling you on the grounds of national security. Now, I may be misunderstanding the Freedom of Information Act, but as far as I know, the national security excuse can only be used if you're dealing with intelligence agencies. So I would continue to ask the question, just exactly what kind of operation is the Counter Disinformation team within the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. But sticking at that sort of time period, the person sort of running the show at that time was Mark Sedwill. So if we look at the sort of network that was there at the time, he was head of the National Security Council, he was head of the Cabinet Office, and of course these two were feeding into the Foreign and Commonwealth Office at the time. Now, I've put the Information Research Department name on there because that was sort of the original Counter Disinformation team, which was shut down by David Steele, if I remember correct, or may have got that wrong, but it was shut down in the 70s, but it didn't really go away. It sort of stayed there in the background and eventually came back out into the open as the Counter Disinformation and Media Development Programme, headed by Andy Price. They funded the Integrity Initiative. Now, Mark Sedwill's gone, of course, and replaced. Andy Price is now gone and replaced. The Integrity Initiative is gone and replaced, and it is in fact replaced with something called the Open Information Partnership, which still exists, and it describes itself as a diverse network of established organisations and individuals across Europe working in open, independent, fact-based reporting. Among us are NGOs, charities, academics, think tanks, journalists, fact-checkers and activists. So just think about that, think about the scale of that, because this was kind of the scale of the Integrity Initiative at the time as well. And so when the Integrity Initiative leaks came out and Carol Cadwallader and Edward Lucas's names were on the list of people working with that organisation, the question then is, are they still working with the successor to that organisation? So just looking at the type of disinformation or the type of stuff that we have seen in the media that came out through that particular infrastructure. This is from a few years ago. Russia spies target coronavirus vaccine, says the BBC. Russia sought to meddle in the UK election, says Dominic Raab. And this is all part of this whole propaganda machine designed to encourage the British public to believe that Russia and China are the threat. Let's just listen to a couple of words from Edward Lucas speaking to The Times.
We are in an existential struggle with Russia, and we can either fight it with Ukraine intact and enthusiastic on our side, or we can wait until Ukraine is beaten and then try and do it on our own. And I fear we're taking the second option at the moment.
So that's just to give an impression of the lunacy that's coming out from these types of circles. And of course, another name that we need to consider here is Tobias Ellwood. And he was speaking to Sky News this morning.
We've seen in Ukraine that there are other ways, particularly in the grey zone, that we could be attacked. I'll give an example. It just took one line of code in Heathrow, which was wrong, to bring the entire airport to a closure. That was by accident. So you can see how easy it is to disrupt our way of life, to sow political discord and indeed economic mayhem from afar.
So that's the narrative from Tobias Ellwood this morning, sowing discord from afar. And this is absolutely the same narrative that we've been hearing from this group of people for quite some time now. But how do you think Sky News described Tobias Ellwood when they introduced him this morning? Let's look at their tweet. Former Defence Minister Tobias Ellwood, did they mention that he's a reservist in 77 Brigade? did they mention or even comment on that, or ask him about it, or hold him to account and ask, was he giving a genuine opinion, or was he propagandizing for the British government at the moment? If you want to know more about that, have a look at this article on the UK Column website. MPs are not entitled to a private public life, which gives a bit of the background to this and a bit of background to Phil Ridley's freedom of information requests on the topic. So what I'm basically saying here is, when we look at headlines like fake UK stamps blamed on Chinese-made counterfeits, and we look at headlines on how China could paralyze Britain and kill thousands by hacking into electric cars, we've got to ask ourselves, what are we looking at? And question, should we be heading towards conflict with these countries? Because the British government already talking about the potential of putting British boots on the ground in Ukraine just for training the Ukrainian troops. So, perhaps cooperation with these countries would be better than conflict. And I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't be judgmental or hold these countries to account for their activities. But at the end of the day, it wasn't China or Russia which caused lockdown or jabs or ULEZ or net zero or censorship or any of the other things. Bill Gates is not Chinese, and the NGOs that have been pushing the narratives in this country are not Chinese or Russian. So we've got to think about that and think about just exactly what's been done to us, and think about what was done to us during lockdown under the guise of emergency legislation. And if we end up in some kind of level of conflict with these countries, what kind of emergency legislation we might be looking at. So that's